There is a world, beyond the reach of sound, beyond the reach of language, where every soul speaks directly into the heart of another. A place where words have never been necessary, where understanding does not travel through the careful shaping of hands or through the vibration of air against a drum deep inside the ear, but arrives whole and complete and overwhelming, like light through a window that has never once been closed. Most of us will only discover that world when we die. He discovered it at the age of 10. His name, for the purposes of this account, is the Silent One. From the very first moment he entered this world, he entered it in absolute silence. Not the silence of a quiet room late at night. The silence he was born into was total, permanent, and without exception. A wall between himself and every sound this world has ever made. A wall that never shifted. A wall that simply was. He was born profoundly deaf. The kind of deafness that cannot be adjusted or measured in degrees, or softened by a device placed carefully behind the ear. The world around him roared and hummed and laughed and wept, and none of it reached him. Not a single vibration of air ever resolved itself into meaning inside those ears. Instead, he learned to read the world through entirely different instruments. He felt the passage of a heavy truck through the soles of his bare feet on the kitchen floor. He knew a door had slammed somewhere in the house by the faint tremor it sent through the wooden hallway beneath him. The world was not silent to him. It was merely translated. His family was hearing, his parents, his siblings, his grandparents. All of them lived inside that world of sound from which he was permanently excluded. They loved him without question. But love, no matter how fierce and real, cannot always find a bridge across every distance. There were moments, ordinary dinner table moments, car ride moments, moments in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, when the Silent One would look up and find everyone around him laughing at something he had not caught, had not been fast enough to follow, and the space between them would open like a valley that neither side quite knew how to cross. Sign language was his native tongue. His hands were his voice. The precise arc of a wrist, the curl of a finger, the deliberate angle of a palm. These were his words, his arguments, his jokes, his questions. He was articulate. He was expressive. He was, in his own language, eloquent. But there are things that even eloquence cannot reach. There are distances that exist beneath language altogether. And the Silent One had been living at the edge of one of those distances since the day he was born. And yet, there were moments, strange, wordless moments, when something seemed to press itself against the inside of his silence, the way a sound presses against a closed door. He would lay his palm flat against the wooden floor of his bedroom and feel vibrations travel through his bones like a question he had no language to answer. He would press his cheek to the wall during a family gathering and feel the faint pulse of music he would never hear. And something in the center of him would ache in a direction he could not name. Like something had always been trying to reach him. Like something had never stopped trying. He was 10 years old. He had already developed the habit of watching, of reading rooms and faces and skies, with an attention that most adults spend a lifetime failing to cultivate. He noticed everything. He missed almost nothing. Because when the world takes one instrument from you, it quietly hands you several others. He did not know, on the morning that would change everything, that he was living inside the final hours of the only life he had ever known. He did not know that every year of silence he had carried since birth, every unreachable sound, every missed word, every song that had passed through the air around him without leaving a single trace, was about to end. Not gradually, not gently, all at once. And what broke through that silence, what poured into him from beyond the edge of this world, would make every year of that silence feel, in retrospect, like a preparation, like the stillness before the first note of something vast and irreversible. This is the story of the Silent One. A child who lived in silence, drowned before he turned 11, and returned from a place where 20 presences spoke directly into the center of who he was. All of them, all at once, in a language that required no hands and no sound, and no translation of any kind. What he saw, what he understood, and what he was shown about the extraordinary purpose hidden inside what this world had always called his loss. Stay close, because what unfolds over the next 45 minutes will challenge everything you think you know about silence, about what it means to truly be heard, and about what is waiting, right now, on the other side of this life, for every single one of us. But before he crossed that border, there was the water. It was the kind of morning that asks nothing of anyone. The light came in at an angle that made everything look generous. The grass, the fence, the surface of the water catching pieces of the sky and holding them still. It was a summer morning, the kind that exists in memory as the definition of ordinary, the kind that families return to years later and cannot fully believe was real. That a morning so unremarkable could have held inside it something so immense. The silent one was 10 years old, and he was outdoors. He had spent the earlier part of the morning the way he spent most mornings, moving through his home with the careful, observant attention that had always been his most defining quality. He noticed the way the light fell across the kitchen floor. He watched his family move through their routines, mouths opening and closing around words he received as shapes rather than sounds, as gestures and rhythms, and the particular tilt of a head that meant something specific to someone who had been reading faces since before he could walk. He was, by most measures, a happy child. Not the uncomplicated happiness of someone who has never known difficulty, but something deeper and more considered than that. The happiness of a child who has made a quiet, unspoken peace with the particular terms of his own life. He had his language. He had his observations. He had the way light moved across surfaces, and the way vibration traveled through floors, and the way his mother's face softened at specific moments that he had learned, with great precision, to anticipate. He had a whole world. It was not the world most children were given, but it was fully, completely, irreversibly his. And on this particular morning, he had stepped outside. The yard was familiar in the way that the spaces children truly inhabit become familiar, not just recognized but absorbed. He had moved through it on countless other mornings, in other summers, in the particular way that children occupy outdoor spaces, which is to say completely, without any part of themselves held back. He could feel the specific vibration of high summer through the soles of his feet, the ground carrying its warmth up through the legs in a way that asks to be noticed. The air held a particular weight, the kind that settles in the last weeks before the season tips. The light was at its most direct, its most indifferent. It landed on everything equally: the grass, the fence line, the surface of the pool, without preference or warning. Somewhere behind him, the sounds of the household continued. Sounds he could not hear, but whose presence he registered in other ways. Through the faint tremor of a door, the distant vibration of a television, the particular quality of the air that told him a space nearby was occupied. The silent one was not alone in the way that truly matters. He was simply, as he had always been, navigating the world through different instruments than those his family relied upon. He was, as far as anyone in that household understood, perfectly fine. At some point during that morning, the exact sequence of events not fully reconstructed, as these things rarely are, the silent one was near the water. This detail matters. He had been near the water before, many times. Water, for the silent one, was one of the few sensory experiences the world offered entirely without barrier. It required no hearing, no translation, no interpretation of another person's face. It existed as pressure against the skin, as temperature, as the way light fractured across its surface in patterns that shifted with every breath of wind, as the particular quality of the air directly above it, slightly cooler, slightly more present, as if the water itself is slowly exhaling. He was not afraid of it. There was no particular reason on this morning for there to be any fear at all. Not because water itself is dangerous. Water is not a villain in this account. Water is simply what the universe selected on this particular morning as the instrument of a passage that had, in some deeper sense, already been scheduled. What came next was not random. What came next was not meaningless. That much the Silent One himself would come to understand. Though not until he had crossed a border no 10-year-old has any business approaching, and looked back at this morning from the other side. But we are not there yet. We are still here, still on this side, still in the warmth and the bird song and the ordinary golden light of a summer morning that had, as of yet, asked nothing of anyone. The water was still. The water was warm. And then, it wasn't. In the seconds that followed, the Silent One's body entered the water, and the world, the ordinary golden birdsong world, ceased to respond. There is no dramatic music for moments like this one. There is no warning. Life does not pause to signal that something permanent is about to happen. It simply happens. The body of the Silent One entered the water. What followed, from a purely physical standpoint, unfolded the way these events always unfold. Quickly, without negotiation, and in the particular silence that belongs to moments the world has not yet been told about. He was in the water. Then he was in difficulty. Then, at some point that no one inside that household registered in real time, he was no longer at the surface. The physiology of what happens to a body in water under these circumstances is well documented. The initial shock, the involuntary response of the muscles, the instinctive attempt at orientation that becomes, within moments, its own particular kind of exhaustion. The body is a remarkable instrument, and like all remarkable instruments, it has a threshold beyond which its resources are simply no longer sufficient to meet the demand being placed upon it. That threshold, for a child of 10, in water, without intervention, arrives with a speed that the clinical literature describes as swift, and the human heart can only describe as incomprehensible. He did not cry out. He could not in any form the world would have heard. There are things that words, even the most carefully chosen words, cannot fully reach. The space between a child at the edge of a pool and a child who needs help is not measured in feet. It is not measured in seconds. It is measured in the precise and devastating gap between the moment something happens and the moment someone else knows it has happened. That gap on this morning was too wide. Water keeps its own counsel. It does not announce what it has taken. The surface of that pool in the minutes that followed looked exactly as it had before. A plane of light and reflection, calm, undisturbed, asking nothing of anyone who might have glanced at it through a window. This is the weight that survivors of these events carry forward. Not the event itself, but the ordinary face the world wore while it was happening. Inside the house, the morning continued. This is the detail that stays with families forever. Not the event itself, but the unremarkable minutes surrounding it. Someone was in the kitchen. Someone was in another room. The machinery of an ordinary morning was still running, and the world had not yet sent any of its signals. The world, as it so often does, was simply waiting for someone to look. When someone did look, what they found in that yard rewrote, in a single instant, everything that morning had been. The response was immediate. The steps that a family takes in those moments, the kind of steps no one ever rehearses, that the body somehow knows anyway, were taken. Emergency services were called. People moved. The particular urgency that exists in those minutes, that total suspension of everything ordinary in service of one desperate intention, descended over that yard with the absolute weight that only these moments carry. The paramedics arrived. The procedures that exist specifically for the border between life and death precise, trained, and performed with everything that medicine, at its most focused, is capable of, were carried out with urgency and with skill. And for a period of time, a period that would later be recorded in clinical language, in the documentation that follows these events, the heart of the Silent One was not beating. He was, by every measurement available to the instruments of this world, gone. His body lay still. The summer light continued to fall across the yard, indifferent, golden, unchanged, the way the world always continues, the way the light always holds its course, in the moments immediately after something irreversible has occurred. The world does not stop. Only the person is gone. And yet somewhere, in a place that holds no address, no coordinates, no position measurable by any instrument we have ever invented, the Silent One was not gone at all. He was only just arriving somewhere. Because in the moment that body went quiet, for the first time in 10 years of absolute silence, something spoke. There is a moment, documented across thousands of accounts from every culture, every era, every language on this earth, when the body and the self part ways, not violently, not with argument. The way a hand releases something it has been holding for a very long time, not because it has been forced open, but because at a certain point, the holding simply ends. For the Silent One, that moment arrived on a summer morning, in a yard he knew by heart, surrounded by people who loved him completely. And it arrived like this. One moment, he was inside his body, inside the familiar architecture of weight and pressure and sensation that he had inhabited for 10 years. Inside the specific bounded experience of being a small person in a physical world. And then, without transition, without any sensation he would later describe as pain, he was not. He was above it. He could see his own body. This is the detail that every person who has passed through this threshold, every account, every testimony, every clinical interview conducted in the decades of research that now surround these experiences, returns to first. The looking down. The strange absolute clarity of seeing the thing you have always been inside, from the outside. He watched the people around him. He watched their movements, the urgency, the focused desperation of hands doing what hands do in those moments. He understood what was happening below him with a completeness that did not require explanation. And yet, he would later describe the quality of that understanding as entirely free of the terror one might expect. It was not detachment. It was something more precise than detachment. It was the particular clarity that exists on the other side of the body's fear, once the body itself is no longer part of the equation. He was 10 years old. He was watching the scene of his own medical emergency from somewhere above it, and he felt calm. Then the scene below receded, not all at once, not through any act of will or intention on his part. The yard, the people, the summer light, the ordinary geography of the life he had just been living, all of it moved away from him, the way a shore moves away from a boat that has slipped its mooring. He was not moving toward anything. The world below was simply becoming less immediate, less necessary, as though it were resolving, gradually, into something he would look back on rather than return to. He was in the void. This is the word most commonly reached for across accounts like this one, when language attempts to describe what comes between the departure from the body and the arrival at whatever follows. The void, not darkness. Darkness implies the absence of light, and the absence of light is still a relationship with light. This was something older than that opposition, a space that existed before the question of light or dark had been asked, before the question of sound or silence. Before, it seemed, the question of anything at all. For a child who had lived his entire life in silence, the void held no terror. It felt instead like something he recognized, like somewhere, in some dimension beneath memory, he had always known this place was there. And then, from somewhere inside the nothing, A light began to form. Not a light he could see, a light he could feel. The light did not arrive. It had always been there. This is the distinction the Silent One would spend years attempting to articulate, that the light he became aware of at the edge of the void was not something that appeared, the way a lamp appears when a switch is thrown. It was something that had been present the entire time, and that he was only now, without the body's constant demands on his attention, capable of perceiving, as though the body, in all its necessary, ordinary, relentless aliveness, had been the only thing standing between him and a frequency that had always been broadcasting, that had never for a single moment stopped. He moved toward it, or perhaps more precisely, he was drawn toward it. The distinction matters because there was no decision involved, no act of will, no moment of choosing. The movement was the most natural thing he had ever experienced, more natural than breathing, which had required effort, more natural than sleep, which had required surrender. This required nothing. He simply went. What he moved through, the Silent One would later describe not as a tunnel in any architectural sense, not a passage with structure and edges and defined dimensions, but as a channel, a corridor of intention, a space that existed specifically for the purpose of conveying something from one state of being to another, and that seemed in some quality he could not name but could not mistake, to be aware of him, to be oriented toward him. The way a current is oriented toward the shore, it is carrying something too. The warmth increased as he moved, not temperature, not the physical sensation of heat against skin, because there was no skin, no surface, no body registering temperature. Something deeper than heat. A quality of welcome that preceded and surpassed every experience of being welcomed that he had encountered in 10 years of physical life. The way love announces itself before it speaks, that wordless, total knowing that something recognizes you and is glad of your presence. And then, he noticed something extraordinary. He had been perceiving everything around him with perfect, effortless clarity, and he had not once reached for his hands. In 10 years of life, every piece of information he had sent out into the world had traveled through his hands. Every question, every answer, every moment of connection, every expression of who he was, all of it had moved through the arc of a wrist, the position of a finger, the specific grammar of a body doing the work that sound had never been available to do. His hands had been his entire outward self, and here, in this passage, in this warmth, in this light, he had no hands, he had no body, he had no instrument of any kind, and he understood everything. The understanding simply arrived, whole, complete, without carrier, without medium, without the gap that always exists in physical life between what one person means and what another person receives. There was no gap. There was no translation required. There was only knowing. Direct, total, and more precise than anything language, in any form, had ever been capable of delivering. The silence that had defined his entire existence was gone, not replaced by sound, by something that had no name in the world he had come from. Something that sound, at its very best, had always only been pointing toward. And somewhere ahead of him, at the far end of the light, they were already waiting. There are no adequate words for what the Silent One arrived into. This is not a failure of description. It is not a limitation of this account, or of the person who experienced it, or of the language being used to carry it. It is a structural fact about the nature of what exists beyond the threshold, that it was not designed to be translated into the vocabulary of a world that experiences reality through 5 senses and measures everything against the coordinates of time and space. And yet, the attempt must be made, because what the Silent One encountered on the other side of that passage was not abstract. It was not vague. It was not the soft, diffuse comfort of a dream dissolving at the edges. It was more real, more textured, more present, more precisely itself than anything he had ever experienced in physical life. This is the detail that researchers of these accounts return to with the consistency of a scientific finding. The other side is not described as less real. It is described, almost universally, as more. The landscape he arrived in had no name that he could assign to it, no coordinates, no scale he could measure against anything he had known. It was vast in the way that certain experiences are vast, not because they occupy great physical space, but because they exceed the capacity of the self to contain them. He was inside something larger than the concept of inside, and it was beautiful. Not beautiful in the way that a landscape or a piece of music or a human face is beautiful, where beauty is a quality perceived from outside the thing, from a position of separation. Beautiful in the way that, and he would return to this description across many years of attempting to articulate it, everything was exactly and completely itself. Nothing was performing, nothing was approximating. Every element of the place existed in a state of total, unmediated presence. And that presence, that absolute there-ness of everything, was what beauty, at its most essential, had always been trying to express. He had arrived. And then, before he had fully registered the landscape, before he had completed even the first act of orienting himself to where he was, he became aware of them. Not visually, not first. What reached him first was the quality of their attention, a warmth directed specifically, precisely, unmistakably toward him. More than 20 distinct presences assembled in the luminous space ahead, each one its own complete and particular center of consciousness, each one oriented toward him with something so concentrated, so specific, so individually calibrated to exactly who he was, that it could only be called by one name: recognition. They knew him, not the version of him the world had seen. The child with the silent ears and the speaking hands and the careful observer's gaze. They knew the part of him that existed before and beneath all of that. The irreducible thing. The part that had never, in 10 years of life, required a single gesture to express itself, because it was not the kind of thing that could be expressed, only known. And they knew it, completely. And in the moment he understood who they were, every single one of them spoke to him, at the same time, and he understood every word. 23 of them. More than 20 by his later account, the exact number less important than the quality of what they represented. Presences, ancestors, beings who had known him before he knew himself, who had been with him in ways invisible to the physical world he had just departed, and who were now, here in this place where nothing could be withheld and nothing needed to be, entirely, undeniably present to him. He knew them, not all of them by any name or face or story his 10 years of physical life had furnished him. Some he recognized by the particular feeling they carried, the way certain people announce themselves not through appearance, but through the specific emotional weather that arrives with them. Others he knew in a way that existed below memory, below history, below any category the physical mind can comfortably contain. He knew them the way the body knows to breathe, not through learning, but through something so fundamental it predates the question of how. And all of them, all at once, simultaneously, without confusion, without the loss of any individual voice inside the whole, were communicating with him. This is the aspect of the Silent One's account that resists ordinary comprehension most fiercely, not because it is unbelievable, but because the physical mind has no existing architecture for it. In the world he had come from, communication is sequential. One person, one message, one recipient, one moment at a time. Even the richest human conversation is a series of individual transmissions, received and processed one by one, however rapidly. What he experienced in that gathering was not sequential at all. All 23 presences communicated with him at the same moment, and he received all of it, completely, without confusion, without the loss of any single thread inside the whole. Every presence was fully present to him at the same instant that every other presence was fully present. Every transmission arrived complete, carrying not just meaning, but the full emotional signature of the being who had sent it. Their recognition, their history, their specific, irreplaceable knowing of who he was and why he was here, and what his life had been in its deepest, most intended sense. He described it, in the years that followed, as the most overwhelming experience of understanding he had ever known or could imagine knowing. Not because the content was complex, but because it was, for the first time in his life, without remainder. Nothing missing. No gap between what was meant and what arrived. No translation. No hands. Just knowing. Instant, total, and filled, to a depth he had no prior measure for, with love. Then the review began. His life, all 10 years of it, visible now not merely as events, but as understood, as purposeful. He saw the dinner table moments of disconnection and knew their function. He saw the years of navigating a world built for instruments he did not possess, and saw what those years had constructed inside him. The attention, the precise and patient art of observation, the particular depth that belongs to those who learn early that the world offers other channels. He saw his mother's face across every moment he had spent trying to read it, and understood finally what it had been saying all along. He saw his silence, the whole of it, and it was not a wound. It was a preparation, specific, chosen, and purposeful. A rehearsal for exactly this, a place where sound was not required, and hands were not needed, and every soul spoke directly into the center of every other soul, without barrier and without loss. He had been practicing his entire life, and he had never known. And then, at the far edge of that light, where the warmth became something beyond warmth and the knowing became something beyond knowing, he saw the line. The line was not a wall. This distinction arrived in the silent one's awareness with the same instantaneous completeness that everything in that place arrived, not as a thought he formed, but as a truth he found himself already inside. It was not a barrier designed to keep him out. It was a threshold designed to make clear what a crossing would mean. It existed not as prohibition, but as information. As the universe's way of ensuring that what happened next was, in whatever sense a 10-year-old consciousness could be said to choose, chosen. Cross this, and there is no path back. He understood this not through warning, not through instruction delivered by any of the presences behind him, but through the simple and total knowing that had characterized every moment of experience in that place. The understanding arrived whole, immediate, and without the possibility of misreading. There was no ambiguity in it. On this side of the line, the world he had come from remained, in some sense, retrievable. On the other side, it did not. And what was on the other side was magnificent. This is the word he would return to, across every account he gave in the years that followed. Not beautiful, though it was that. Not peaceful, though it was that too. Magnificent. The specific quality of something so far beyond the scale of anything previously encountered that the mind does not attempt to receive it as ordinary. The light on the other side of that line was not a brighter version of the light already surrounding him. It was a different category entirely. The source of that light, the origin of the warmth, the place from which everything he had already experienced in that realm had come, and toward which it had always, in its own way, been reaching. He wanted to cross. The wanting was total and without apology, and unlike any wanting he had ever known in physical life, because it carried no anxiety, no grasping, no fear of disappointment. It was not the wanting of something he might not receive. It was the recognition of something he already, in some fundamental and pre-physical sense, belonged to. And yet, he turned back toward the presences, the 23, the gathering that had spoken into him simultaneously, that had held the entirety of his 10 years inside their knowing and returned it to him as understood. They were still there, still warm, still oriented toward him with that quality of attention that has no analog in physical life, the attention of those who love without condition and without limit, and without the possibility of withdrawal. What they communicated to him in that moment was not an instruction. It was a question, offered with complete freedom on both sides, posed with the same unconditional love that had surrounded every moment of his time in that place, and received by him with the full clarity that only that place makes possible. He understood what was being asked. He understood both answers with equal completeness. He understood with a depth no 10-year-old body could have contained exactly what each choice would mean for him and for the life that was still on the other side of the void, technically available to him. The line waited, the presences waited, and the silent one, a child of 10 standing at the absolute boundary of everything, made his choice. He turned away from the line, and the moment he did, the landscape, the light, the gathered presences, the warmth of that place began to recede. The receding was gentle. This matters, because every instinct available to the physical imagination insists that a forced return to life would be violent, sudden, a rupture, and the silent one's account insists on something different. The departure from that place did not feel like an ejection. It felt like a tide going out, like the slow, inevitable withdrawal of something that had always known, even as it held him, that this was always going to be temporary. The warmth did not snatch itself away. It released him gradually, with a quality that he would spend years searching for the right word to describe, and that he eventually settled on as tenderness. The presences stayed with him as long as they could. This too is something he has returned to repeatedly. That they did not simply vanish the moment his choice was made. They remained present at the edges of his awareness through the early part of the descent, their communication continuing at a diminishing frequency as the distance between them grew. The last thing he received from them was not a word, not a specific transmission, not a final piece of instruction. It was a feeling. The feeling of being known completely and loved without reservation by beings who had watched him arrive in a physical world and live inside its constraints for 10 years and never, not for a single moment of any of those years, looked away. He carried that with him into the passage. The passage felt shorter in this direction. Or perhaps time, which had not operated in that place in any way he recognized, was reasserting itself, making its presence known the way it always does after an absence, with a slight insistence, a subtle pressure, the sense of clocks resuming. He moved through the corridor of light and felt the warmth of the other side withdraw behind him the way the warmth of a room withdraws when you step outside into winter. Not all at once, but in a gradient that the body tracks with the specific sadness of something ending. The void received him briefly on the other side of the passage. That same spacious, dimensionless dark, no longer frightening, no longer unfamiliar. He had been here before. He knew now what it bordered. He knew now what it was, the space between. And then, with a swiftness that surprised him after the long, slow grace of everything that had preceded it, he felt the body, not entered it, not inhabited it, felt it. The way you feel a wall in the dark before you reach it, its weight, its specific density, the unmistakable signature of a physical form that had been his for 10 years, and that was waiting, somewhere very close, with a particular and urgent need to be returned to. The world was rising up to meet him, and there was nothing gentle about what happened next. The body received him the way bodies receive consciousness after long absence, without ceremony, without gentleness, and without any concession to where he had just been. The first sensation was weight, not the metaphorical weight of returning responsibility or returning grief, the literal, physical, sudden presence of gravity as an experience, after a period during which gravity had simply not been a feature of existence. The body is heavy. This is a fact so ordinary that living inside one makes it invisible. The silent one felt it as though for the first time, the specific downward insistence of a physical form in a physical world. And the contrast with where he had been was total and immediate and beyond any capacity for gradation. Then came the cold, the clinical environment, the sounds he could not hear but whose vibrations reached him through the surface beneath him. The hands of the paramedics, present, urgent, skilled, working on a body that had, by every measure those hands possessed, been absent. The transition between the two states of being was not a journey. It was a collision. He did not speak of what had happened immediately. He could not. Not because the experience had been traumatic in the ordinary sense of that word, but because there is a period in the aftermath of an encounter with something that large, during which the ordinary instruments of communication feel not merely inadequate, but almost beside the point. The hands that had always been his voice were there. They could move, but what they had been given to say was not something that the grammar of any language, signed or spoken, had been constructed to hold. What he carried back was not information in the ordinary sense. It was not a list of revelations, not a set of instructions to be transcribed and delivered. It was a knowing, structural, permanent, installed at a level beneath articulation. The kind of understanding that does not require expression to be real, because its reality does not depend on being communicated. It simply is. It persists. It operates, silently and continuously, in everything that follows. He knew that the silence he had lived inside was not a flaw in his design. He knew that love, the specific, overwhelming, total love he had received from 23 presences who knew him more completely than he had ever known himself, was not something that existed only on the other side of death. It was the substance of which everything, on both sides, was made. The light he had seen was not somewhere else. It was here, in this cold and heavy and insistently physical world, simply at a frequency that most living bodies, in the ordinary noise of being alive, could not yet perceive. His deafness had always been pointed at something. He understood that now. The silent one grew up. He is an adult now, living inside the same world he departed at 10 years old, carrying inside him a knowing that has not faded across all the years that separate that summer morning from today. He still communicates through sign language. He still inhabits the silence that has been his since birth. But the silence, he will tell you, is not the same silence it was before. It has something in it now. A frequency he recognizes. He does not describe what happened to him as a tragedy interrupted. He does not describe his deafness as a wound that was explained. He describes the whole of it, the years of silence, the water, the void, the light, the 23 presences, the line, the choice, the return, as a single coherent experience, as something that was, from the beginning, one thing. Not a life interrupted by a death, a life that included, at its center, a brief and total encounter with what life is actually made of. He came back, he says, knowing one thing above all others, that the love he felt in that place, the love that 23 presences transmitted to him simultaneously without language, without hands, without any instrument at all, is not exclusive to the other side. It is here. It has always been here. It is the frequency beneath every frequency, the ground beneath every ground, the silence beneath every silence. You do not have to drown to find it. But sometimes, it takes everything going completely quiet before you can hear it. If this story moved something in you, if some part of you recognized what the silent one found on the other side of that water, then you already know what this channel is for. Subscribe. Stay close. Because the accounts we explore here are not entertainment. They are testimony. They are what human beings have been trying to tell each other, across every era and every language on this earth, about the nature of what we are and where we go. The next story is already waiting.